Aloha, and welcome back to Leaving the Church to Find God, your safe space for exploring faith beyond traditional walls. I'm your host, Melissa, and whether you grew up in the evangelical church like I did, or any other system while seeking answers, you're in the right place. This podcast isn't about judgment or attacking institutions. It's about honest conversations, diverse spiritual paths, and celebrating the unique journeys that we all take in search of meaning. We've all experienced indoctrination in some form, and here we explore how it shapes our understanding of ourselves and the divine. Each week, we'll dive into thought-provoking topics, share inspiring stories from guests and listeners like you, and offer tools and insights for navigating your own deconstruction journey. Remember, leaving the church doesn't mean leaving your faith. It's about finding your own authentic connection to something greater. So buckle up, embrace the open dialogue, and join me as we explore what it means to move beyond confines and discover the deeper personal connection to the divine that exists within us all. Aloha, God Pod. I am so happy to be back after a few weeks of a little break. And today we have an amazing guest. He is a powerhouse in the world of scholarship and advocacy, formerly the Justice, Equity, and Transformation Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Calgary. Dr. Lucas Wilson is currently an SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Toronto Mississauga. Please forgive my pronunciation. His work examines the intersections of memory, trauma, religion, and social justice, particularly in the LGBTQ plus space and Holocaust studies. Dr. Wilson is the editor of Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy, amplifying the voices of those who have endured and resisted harmful religious and cultural practices. He is also the author of At Home with the Holocaust, Post-Memory, Domestic Space, and Second-Generation Holocaust Narratives, which won the Jordan Schnitzer First Book Publication Award. Additionally, he co-edited Emerging Trends in Third-Generation Holocaust Literature. And beyond academia, Lucas is a passionate public intellectual with his writing featured in The Advocate, Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, Religion Dispatches, and other platforms. His work challenges dominant narratives, pushes for justice, and uplifts marginalized voices. And y'all know that's what we're all about on here. So, welcome, Dr. Lucas Wilson. What's your leaving the church story?
Oh, shoot. It's a years-long story, but I'll do my best to condense it, into a bite-size, audio.
Well, when did things start
piece.
to kind of crack for you from the indoctrination to?
I would say that a big part of it initially started with my sexuality. I knew that I was gay since I was, super young. But I wouldn't ultimately say that was, what pushed me out of the church. But it was the beginning of what, opened my eyes to the fact that I didn't fit within this religious tradition that, like, definitionally, because according to evangelicalism, you can't be queer and, Christian. Obviously, I think, that is possible, but that's not my sort of question at this point. And I don't really desire to be a Christian. I'm not a person of faith anymore. But at the time, I knew I was told that I wasn't able to be both queer and Christian. So that for me really sent me on a journey initially to reconcile my faith with my sexuality. And again, it poked a lot of holes in the cosmology or sort of the worldview of evangelicalism. But really what pushed me out of the church ultimately was my research, and most of my research up until this point has really focused on the Holocaust. And so I was, reading a bunch of Jewish authors, specifically Holocaust survivors, and one in particular, Elie Wiesel. And I remember reading his protests against God. And of course, it's ironic that so many of us were part of the Protestant tradition, which, initially was, a tradition that was protesting or pushing against the Catholic Church. However, for those of us, who were in this tradition anytime recently, protest is not really something, that we connect to our relationship with God. Like, we are told to submit, to obey, and just to follow orders. But I started reading these authors, particularly, again, Elie Wiesel, and was coming across, these accounts of people saying no to God. And that for me was wild. Like, it really pushed my comfortability and pushed me in my comfortability. And I realized that, it's okay to say that I don't think that certain things that have happened throughout history are okay. It's okay for me to then say that it's not okay that God did nothing or did something or whatever the case might have been. And so for me, it was researching the Holocaust where ultimately I decided that I couldn't really believe in a good God if I were to, be honest with the realities of so many people, myself included, that really would preclude me from believing in a good God because there's so much, to put it academically, shit that happens in this world, and I simply would not be able to live with myself and live comfortably if I were to say that God was good and allowed these things or did these things. And so for me, it was really research, it was study, it was encountering voices that were different from my own that ultimately pushed me out of the church, even though oftentimes I think a lot of people, particularly those who are still within the church, would love to say that it was my sexuality that pushed me out. It was my, my sin nature that really I had to go pursue. But no, it was more of an intellectual thing for me, where I simply and also a hard issue as well. Like it's a moral and ethical question as well. I simply could not live with myself and remain an evangelical.
Yeah. That makes sense. I'm going to take a pause. I'm getting some feedback on your microphone. Do you know what might be happening?
No. Should I come closer is it okay if I come closer? Or does it work
better?
Yeah,
of course.
Okay. Does this work better?
I think that helps. Okay. We'll see once we get going, but okay. So, let me get back to my train of thought there. Yeah, I completely understand that. I know for me, it was a lot of things not adding up. Like God is love and all of these beautiful things that Christians are meant to be, and everything, so much, not everything, but so much of what I was being taught and what was being enforced was just in contradiction to that, specifically, like the way that we treat others and marginalized people and those on the fringe, right? And how it was not a reflection, because I remember learning, I think it was my mom that told me, I'm like, what does it even mean to be a Christian? And she's like, oh, it means to be Christ-like. And I'm like, well, I feel like the actions that I'm taking and the compassion that I have is aligned with Christ. And these things that you're telling me are right or wrong, or I should be doing or should not be doing, are not aligned with Christ. So I don't even know. So I feel like in that definition, I would consider myself a Christian. But by any other definition, most definitely not. So it's interesting, the cognitive dissonance that happens, especially within the evangelical church, but within a lot of these oppressive, like, religious systems in general. So I think it's interesting. I didn't expect to go in this direction, but talking about your work with the Holocaust and everything, I was thinking about this earlier and what we're experiencing right now in the United States. What can you see as far as the way that the church is aligning in the political spectrum and history repeating itself and such? What are your feelings about that?
Yeah, you know what, and I'll preface everything and then I'll jump into what I'm about to say. So I'm always very skeptical when anyone makes any claims like, oh, what we're seeing today is what happened in Nazi Germany. And I always say that history doesn't repeat itself, but history rhymes, right? And we can see so many parallels between what happened then and what happened today. Again, I think it does. There is some nuance, obviously, and we need to be sort of, careful with exactly what we are saying. And because again, that's a pretty extreme sort of comparison to make, but it is a comparison I think worth making. You can see so many of Trump's recent actions mirroring or again rhyming with what we saw during the rise of Hitler and then ultimately Hitler's reign of terror from 1933 to 45. And so I think that really when we're talking about what's happening today, I think we can use one example of what we're seeing as sort of again being a continuation or a sort of a similar sort of occurrence is that queer folks are some of the first to be targeted, right? If we think of during Hitler's reign, there was this queer sexologist, right, who had this whole body of work, this library of work, and that entire body of work was burned, right? And that was the first sort of book banning and protest that was, or not book banning, but I guess like protest against, ideas. And we see today who are some of the first folks who had been targeted by Trump. And even in his inaugural, address, he was talking about, queer folks and how it's, again, by omission. He didn't say queer folks specifically, but he said there are only two genders, right? And of course, this is an indirect allusion to trans folks. And so gender nonconforming and queer people are, the first to be targeted. And again, there are multiple other people and groups of people who are targeted as well. But that's just one example, right? There's so much that we can see that, again, rhymes with what we've seen in the past. And this is terrifying. And this is a wake-up call. If for anyone, to name another podcast, the Straight White American Jesus, they've been covering some of this as well, looking at, the echoes from the past and how we're seeing these reverberations today. And so all of this to say is that I 100% agree that there are so many continuities with what we're seeing today that we saw, again, specifically in Nazi Germany, as well as other, dictatorships throughout, the recent past. Again, there is, necessity to nuance these things, and there is, a necessity to make sure that we're, not making sort of bold or histrionic claims for the sake of making histrionic claims. But when the shoe fits, put it on, right? I think that to your point, I think you're on target.
And how do you feel like, as far as the because I don't know, I know you're in Canada, but how much you're following American politics, but I do know that it kind of filters out worldwide, and especially coming from the United States. But as far as like, I've just seen like a lot, especially in the right wing of the evangelical church, really taking a foothold. Do you feel like it's more of taking advantage of a moment or an alignment with the ideals, like at any cost, let's get this indoctrination further, like let's further indoctrinate the people, no matter the residuals? Or like, what do you feel about that?
I think that, white Christian nationalism, which is, of course, what we're seeing today is textbook white Christian nationalism, right? Like, this is sort of like the culmination of so many years of white Christian nationalists working against the best interests of the majority for their own interests. And I think that history in and of itself speaks to how so much of evangelicalism is not about Jesus, and going back to how you defined as an almost Christian, right? Like that, to be Christ-like. That's not been the goal for a number of years. The goal has been power, right? And I don't necessarily mean every single evangelical or white Christian fundamentalist or charismatic or whatever. I'm talking about the leadership. This has been a targeted plan for years, and we can trace this back throughout the past 60 years, right? This is really going back to around the 70s, when we see the rise of people like Anita Bryant, Phyllis Schlafly, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson. These morons, to put it again academically, these are the people who are the intellectual, and I feel so disingenuous using the phrase intellectual to describe them, but nonetheless, they are the intellectual sort of front runners of this movement that we're seeing today. Again, not to say that there weren't white Christian fundamentalists before, there were, but they were in their nascent stages. And really, these bigwigs within the new Christian right were the ones who were creating the conditions and setting up the blueprints for what we're seeing today. So this has been in the making for decades. And so seeing what we're seeing today shouldn't be a surprise to so many of us. And for a lot of us, it's not, right? Like, a lot of us know, we've seen this for years. It's simply that the rest of the world is now waking up to the fact that, the church and, the Protestant church, as well as the Catholic Church. And of course, when we're thinking about Project 2025, we're talking about a document that was, again, created by a number of Christians, a lot of them evangelical, but also a number of Catholics. And we can think about J.D. Vance and his connections to the Catholic Church and to these Catholic organizations, these rad trad, again, morons. All of this to say, these people have been working in conjunction for years to execute what is happening today. And of course, I'm hoping that there's going to be some sort of resistance, from Christians, who profess the name of Christ as their savior, or profess Jesus as their savior, but also from politicians, right? And from grassroots organizations. And we are seeing that resistance. However, the question is, how durable is democracy? How durable is, the Constitution? And again, we're going to see probably in the next few months, which sounds very doomsday to say, but I do think that what we're seeing right now is going to be leading to some pretty scary consequences unless people step up and start acting. We'll see what happens, and it's terrifying to say that. And for me as a Canadian, watching this from the outside, it's scary for us too, because so much of what's happening in the U.S. bleeds over into Canada. So much of what happens in the U.S. bleeds over into other countries. And again, what happens with the U.S. is going to affect Ukraine. What happens in the U.S. is going to affect Palestine. What happens in the U.S. is going to affect so many different countries, right? And so it's not exclusive to the U.S. It is something that certainly has numerous geopolitical consequences for the rest of the world. And so we watch onwards and are terrified.
Yeah, that's understandable. We are too.
Yeah, no, of course.
I feel like, I have this false sense of being in a bubble because I live in Hawaii. So there is a little bit of a progressive protection to a degree, but I also know that 90 miles off our coast, Cuba has nuclear weapons just ready to go. So I mean, not Cuba, sorry, I say Cuba because I was taking 90 miles off the coast, but Russia has nuclear weapons 90 miles off the coast of the island. So it's a false sense of security. I do understand that, but I do feel like I have 7 nieces who live in the state of Georgia, and I feel much more frightened for them and their future than I do for mine right now, because they are in the deep south of the United States. And there's just a lot. We can do a lot of future tripping and catastrophizing. And like you said, you don't want to, but if the shoe fits, it's there are a lot of warning signs, and it's ignoring the warning signs and downplaying them that leads to, further disaster and change. So back to the queer community, I'm neurodivergent, and I've really just learned, the more I learn about myself, everything is on a spectrum, sexuality, gender identity, there is no binary, everything is on a spectrum. And I believe that, I'm also of Native American descent, and being transgender is a blessing, and you're considered highly spiritual and in touch with, both the masculine and feminine energies. And it's the same in Hawaii. We have the Mahu that, it's just very accepted culturally. And I know that goes on in other cultures as well. So I don't know. I feel like, some of the most marginalized people, being the queer community, the transgender community, especially, and Black women, are typically the most powerful and the most tuned in people that I've met, as far as tuned into the pulse of humanity and moving humanity forward in a progressive way, being in touch with the spiritual realm. How do you see that connected to this agenda with the far right? Do you feel like there's a correlation, or that it's just a personal, denial of their own spectrums within? I don't know. I'm just curious how you feel about that.
No, if we're talking about people, if we're talking about trans folks, we're talking about Black folks, we're talking about women, we're talking about queer folks. I think all of these folks, and I'm not obviously most of those things, I'm just a gay man, but, for those of us who are on the margins, I think, to talk about how you're saying these folks are most tapped into reality. That they're able to see the sort of the contours and what's happening perhaps in a clearer way than a lot of other folks. I think that's because we're not blinded by our privilege in the same way that straight white men are. Again, I'm a white man, I'm not straight, but I think that queerness decenters me in a way that allows for me to look onwards and have a critical distance from the majority. I think for women, this is of course the case. I think for Black folks, this is of course the case. For trans folks, this is of course the case, right? We are not privileged, and we in the same way that straight white men are. And so I think that it only makes sense that there is some sort of vision, right? There is some sort of alternate understanding and perhaps clearer understanding of the world, because these are folks who have come from perspectives that are not dominant, and therefore we see from below, right, in a lot of ways. And of course, our identities are intersecting, and there are certain parts that perhaps, as a white man, I'm blinded to, for sure, and there's no doubt there. But what I will say is that it only makes sense that these are the folks who are visionaries. And if we think about, artists, right, and authors and musicians, dancers, whomever, some of the most beautiful art really is not coming. In fact, the vast majority of the most beautiful art is not coming from straight white men. Not to say that isn't possible, but it's perhaps not as likely. And so I think what you're saying is spot on, and it only makes sense because I think these positions afford us the vision that we wouldn't have had if we were from the center.
Yeah. I like that perspective. Because I often wonder, like, what it's like a chicken or the egg. Are these groups marginalized because of their internal power, or is their internal power because they're marginalized? And maybe it's a little bit of both, but it's nice to see it from both sides. I feel like there's a lot of people fearing their own shadows and their own parts of themselves that they're afraid to see, especially within the straight white male community, because I don't know that there really are straight white males. I think that inside there's always a curiosity or a desire in any person, and it's this idea that they're meant to be this trope of this straight white male, but have this thing inside of them that they're fighting so hard against. And if everybody could just realize that and get on the same page, then we could all just take a deep breath, a sigh of relief, and just be ourselves, right?
Yeah. I think about that, again, I think when we think about those who are in opposition to us, and oftentimes it's straight white men, there are other groups too, but it's quite common for it to be straight white men. And, just look at the president, look at the vice president, look at the other president or king, whatever you want to call him at this point. And then, those in the Senate and the House and all that. These folks, I find it funny, the folks who are most vocal against queer, the queer community, or queer communities more accurately, I should say, are, the question is why, it begs the question, why are they so vocal? And, you can think of a number of politicians in the past who it later came out that they were queer. And these were the most sort of angry, impassioned people against the queer community. And so I think that oftentimes it's the hatred that they spew is really hatred for themselves. And what they hate is what they see within themselves. And so I'm with you. I think a lot of times these folks, you have to wonder, like, what's their investment in anti-queer politics? Why are they so passionate? I think it's because oftentimes it's a reflection of their own biography.
Yeah, I see that for sure. I mean, just like during the Republican National Convention, and like Grindr went off the charts, and usage during the Republican National Convention, there's no coincidence to that. And I don't know, part of me, a big part of me feels like this is just kind of like that, Custer's last stand. It's that last fight against the opening and the awakening of humanity, and this unity that we are all working towards, hopefully, and that this is patriarchy and these oppressive systems kind of just trying to grab as much power as they possibly can, because they know that it's coming to an end. Hopefully it will come to an end in our lifetimes. I don't know how long this takes or what the process is, but I can only hope that this is working towards a better future and not towards a worse one, even if it is worse, temporarily. But yeah, so going to your work, what are you most excited that you're working on right now? I know that you said, you switched from this Holocaust conversation to the queer conversation. What do you feel like you're really passionate about right now?
Yeah, so while I was right now, I'm in my second postdoc. I did my first postdoc at the University of Calgary. Now this one's at University of Toronto Mississauga. Before that, I was a PhD student, and while I was in my PhD program, I realized and was told that I needed to switch gears. And the reason was, as one of my dissertation committee members said, he said to me, "Luke, the world doesn't care about Jews anymore." And up until that point, and he was a Jewish man, my entire committee was Jewish. And so up until that point, I had devoted all of my time and attention to most of my time and attention, I should say, to Jewish literature, specifically Holocaust literature. And so hearing that kind of freaked me out. And I was like, well, gosh, I need to pivot. And I had, up until that point, I had started to also consider the possibility of doing research on evangelicals, just because I knew at that point that, because, through a number of conversations with different academics and archivists and whatnot throughout my research, people were pushing me and saying, hey, you should do more work about, your experience as an evangelical. And I didn't really know at the time how to do work about myself, and do, some sort of auto-analysis. That for me was very much new. But I started thinking about it. And when my dissertation committee member said this, it solidified the idea that I need to get my, button gear and start figuring out an alternative academic path. And so I decided that I would again focus on evangelicals and particularly, or more broadly, the New Christian Right, because it's the world that I knew, unfortunately, in a personal way. And so I had insight already. And so I thought, I'm not going to start from scratch and go into a different field that I had no knowledge base, in which I had no knowledge base. And so I decided that I was going to, focus on the New Christian Right and its relationship to gender and sexuality. And so that's where my first book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, or my first edited collection. It's actually my second edited collection, but my first public-facing edited collection, non-academic edited collection, came from. And it's looking at, conversion practices largely within the New Christian Right, but not exclusively, looking at, conversion therapy. And it was, again, very much a literary representation or exploration of conversion practices. And so that one, it's come out, and that's in a large part probably actually why we're even chatting, because that book is now out and I'm excited about it. But to actually answer your question, what am I working on now? It is currently another edited collection, but this one's going to be about queer experiences at Christian colleges, universities, and seminaries. And so looking at, what it's been like for so many students, and there is a significant population of queer folks at these schools and who have gone to these schools over the past, say, 60, 70 years. Or really, there have always been queers at these schools. It's just a matter of folks have started talking about it more recently. And so that's what I'm working on right now. Again, for me, I'm fascinated by evangelicals. I'm fascinated by white Christian fundamentalists and how they understand sex, how they understand gender, and again, how much it really is a reflection of their own appetites and desires. And so that's the project right now. But it fits into this larger constellation of research on queer folks and their relationship to the New Christian Right.
So let's get a little more into, because I have had lots of queer guests on the podcast. Obviously, it comes into the conversation quite often. But let's get more into the nitty gritty of how that happened, like how the church kind of adopted this idea and it became part of the doctrine.
Mm-hmm. So 1946 is when the word homosexuality first enters the English Bible. Before that, it was translated a bunch of different ways, most commonly sexual morality, but other words were used in its place. And so this, oftentimes I think a lot of Christians and folks in general think that the word homosexuality, has been in the Bible since, since the beginning. It hasn't. The word homosexuality didn't even come into like any lexicon until the 1800s. It wasn't a conception of human sexuality until the 1800s. And so this is really a modern invention within the past, well, I'm not good at math, but since the 1800s. And so all this to say is that, obviously there was anti-queer theology before 1946. And, there were condemnations of queers before 1946, again, based on the interpretation of scripture before this modern translation. But really, a lot of this anti-queer, rhetoric really amped up in more recent decades. Like, this has not been something that, obsessed with in the way that they are obsessed with sexuality and gender today. Of course, even in thinking about the difference between, say, the 1980s and today, what was the conversation in the 80s? It was against gays, right? It was against, and they used the word gays. They didn't use the acronym, and I don't think a lot of folks actually use the acronym LGBTQ, right? This was more, it was targeted against gay men, and under that umbrella, or gays, and under that umbrella was largely gay men, but of course, lesbians as well. They weren't talking about gender nonconforming people, really. I mean, yes, there were certain instances, and yes, there were moments where they talked about it, but it wasn't the obsession that it was until after, gay marriage was legalized, right? You can think about like how the focus really shifted once gay marriage was legalized. Again, there were conversations before gay marriage was legalized. There was conversations about which bathroom, folks should use and all this kind of tomfoolery. However, again, anti-trans rhetoric specifically really is, a product of the past 20 years. Again, there were conversations before, and there, and there will be conversations after about, anti-gay teachings. But again, right now we're really talking about anti-trans teaching. So when we're talking about these, like the sexuality politics, and we're talking about gender politics, like a lot of what we're seeing in the intensification of these conversations really starts in the 70s, 60s, 70s. But really in the 70s, if we're talking specifically about anti-queer politics in relationship to the New Christian Right, we're talking about our girlfriend, Anita Bryant, right? She's the one who really kickstarts this conversation in a way that no one had before her. Jerry Falwell picks up on it really quickly. He jumps on the bandwagon. Well, Anita Bryant gets a divorce. She sort of falls out of favor, and Falwell continues with it, right? Again, amongst a number of other, prominent, at the time, white Christian fundamentalists, but eventually evangelicals. He turned sort of neo-evangelical afterwards. And so, again, a lot of what we're talking about really starts in 1946. Again, not saying it came out of nowhere. There was a lot of precedent set by the church that was anti-queer. But really, when we're talking about really homophobic and transphobic theology, we're thinking of, a lot of the history really sort of amped up after the Holocaust, after World War II.
So kind of carrying on those ideals, like even though the Holocaust had ended, just try to kind of cement that into society would you say was kind of the motivation behind that?
Well, you know what? I'll answer the question by way of a story. And so I remember I was at Northwestern for a summer program in, I think it was like 2018. And it was around this time that I started to pivot and think more about, other research areas besides just the Holocaust. But this seminar I was at, this summer program, I was there, it was focusing on the Holocaust. And one of the folks that was there to lecture, Dagmar Herzog, who's at CUNY in New York, she came, and first of all, she's just this unbelievable mind. Like, she's just a whip, and she's so sharp. And she comes in, blows everyone's mind, starts talking, and within an hour, everyone's just like, "Who is this?" Like, well, I think a lot of folks knew who she was. I didn't up until that point. But so I'm sitting there listening to her, and she's describing Nazi understandings of sexuality. Again, Nazis didn't come up with these understandings of sexuality, but they certainly did mobilize them, right, in a very death-dealing, in a literal and figurative death-dealing way, putting queers in concentration camps. But she starts talking about all these understandings of sexuality that, again, were really popularized and popular amongst Nazis. And so as I'm sitting there listening to her talk about these understandings of sexuality, I'm sitting there and thinking to myself, dear God, like, this sounds so much like my experience in conversion therapy. And I'm like, this is like, it was uncanny. So afterwards, I went up to Dagmar and I said, "Hey, thanks so much for your lecture. I couldn't help but notice the parallels between what you were describing as Nazi understandings of sexuality and conversion therapy's understanding, or conversion ideology's understanding of sexuality." And I told her, I went through conversion therapy at Jerry Falwell's University and blah, blah, blah. And she goes, "First of all, let me give you a hug." So she gives me a hug. She says, "I'm so sorry you dealt with that." But then on top of that, she says, "No one's ever really done this research connecting the two, and you should be the one to do it. The problem is I don't speak German, so I can't actually do this work because I'd have to go back to the original German sources." However, she did have a number of these German sources in translation, which, is easy for someone like me to read. But again, to be actually, a scholar in the field, you need to be doing work in the original language. I can't do that. So that's someone else's job and someone else's, future project. However, at this point, I just think to myself, even if conversion therapists didn't directly take, Nazis' understandings of sexuality and use them in their work in a very like pick up and place in their work sort of way, the fact of the matter is that these two understandings of sexuality are unbelievably similar. And my critique is, even if you are an evangelical and even if you don't think it's okay to be gay, the fact that you have shared beliefs with Nazis should offer you bare minimum pause, if not push you to reject these ideas altogether, right? And so I don't know, and I sincerely don't know what is the direct connection between these understandings of sexuality and how they were mobilized in, for instance, the ex-gay movement. Something tells me, and again, my inclination is that there is a connection. I just don't know what that is. But what I will say is that the understandings themselves, and sort of from my perspective, which is, obviously not completely informed in how Nazis, or what was actually taken from these sources. But my hunch is that there is a connection. And again, the fact that there is such a parallel is terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I feel so like naive right now, but I did not know that queer people were put in concentration camps during the Nazi regime.
Yeah, they were referred to as homosexuals, which even today the scholarship still refers to them as homosexuals, which I find kind of wild. But a number of queer folks were imprisoned for the fact that they were queer.
Even if they weren't Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of groups. You can think of, communists, you can think of Jehovah's Witnesses, you can think of queer folks, you can think of a number of groups outside of, the Jewish community who were targeted by the Nazi regime. Again, the principal target of the Holocaust were Jews, but there were a number of other groups who were certainly victimized as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important to highlight, because I don't know about other Americans, but that was not included in our history of the Holocaust. So I feel like that's really, really important information for people to be cognizant of in current times, and the way that things are trying to move, And I do believe there is a resistance. I do believe that, if nothing else, even the people who've been very complacent have a certain level of comfort that they're accustomed to, and that level of comfort is being questioned. So if that's what gets them off the couch, then, whatever it takes. But I do believe that there is, when the election happened, there was like this inner knowing in me. And I was, of course, devastated, but also very calm, and just like, well, I always knew I was born for a revolution. So here we are, and I believe much of the revolution is happening internally. It's us doing our shadow work, going internally and looking at our own shame and our own parts of ourselves that have been outcast, and finding acceptance and love for that, which brings, even in the ideas of mindful self-compassion, and acceptance of others. So I feel like that, is all hand in hand, but I digress. Talking about conversion therapy. So what was that experience like for you?
A lot of fun. No, I'm kidding. It was not a lot of fun. Yeah, we even had party hats and streamers. No, it was terrible. So for me, my conversion therapy experience happened at Liberty University, the world's largest evangelical university, located in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I was there for 4 years, and for 4 years I was in their conversion therapy program, their one-on-one conversion therapy program, which consisted of a number of different elements. For me, I chose to go in there willingly. I'm the one who signed up for it. And again, we can talk more about agency and choice and how that's complicated for those within evangelical spaces, and how, I was pushed to believe that I wanted to change. Yes, again, I was made to believe that I wanted to change. And so we can talk more about that after. But for me, I was led to believe that I could not be queer and a Christian. So of course, if I had to choose between myself and God within that, religious world, the obvious answer was God. And so I thought, okay, if I want to be, faithful, I need to, become straight, or at least find attraction to a woman, that unicorn of a woman, and marry her. And so that was my big idea. So I went to Liberty, and fast forward a few weeks, and I had this really bizarre one night stand with one of my spiritual life directors on my dorm, and so he afterwards wouldn't talk to me, and so I was sort of devastated, and I had no one with whom I could speak. Right, I was on a campus where if you were caught doing anything queer, you could be suspended, you could be punished, you could be expelled. So I thought to myself, well, I need to talk to someone. And at that point, I decided that the best idea was to go talk to this guy on campus whose job it was, and he was a paid university employee to deal with, my quote unquote same-sex attraction, which is how Christians, of course, frame queerness. They don't say that you're queer; they say that you struggle with same-sex attraction, which is a way of divorcing the individual from the sexuality. And so I went to this conversion therapist. His name is Dane Emmerich. He framed it as pastoral counseling, which oftentimes conversion therapists don't call it conversion therapy. They call it something else, and they use these dog whistles that those of us now who are outside of the system, and we know what they mean by that. But at the time, it was framed as biblical counseling or pastoral counseling, whatever. And so I went and met with him for over the span of my 4 years. And conversion therapy for me consisted largely talk therapy. And so in the beginning, it was very much he wanted to understand the root causes, quote unquote, of my sexuality, and the way that he understood it was through a very pseudo-Freudian, understanding of human sexuality, that it had to have been the result of either my mom or my dad, right? And so to go back to the source, and the source, according to my conversion therapist, was my mom. My dad and I always had a great relationship, whereas my mom and I, it was a good relationship, but she was also very overbearing and, was wild. My mom is wild. Always has been, always will be. But she was, said to be the cause of my queerness because she was too overbearing, which precluded me from living, comfortably, quote unquote. And I say all this with quotation marks, but everything within evangelicalism is in quotation marks, but precluded me from living in the world of men. And because I wasn't able to mature, naturally and be a real boy, which of course a real boy in their estimation is a straight boy. I was, playing with girls and doing the things that girls did. And so by the time I hit puberty, according to this idea, this thinking, I went for what was opposite of me, because again, evangelicals love the binary, and so they were very much like, it's either you're either this or you're this, and so you go for what's opposite. So they said, because I was living in the world of femininity, I went for what was opposite, which was masculinity, which was boys and then later men. And so it was said over, my predilection for men was then habituated over time, where I started acting on it, and I was confusing my desire for masculinity by pursuing erotic or sexual relationships with men. And then by the time I was an adult, this was really solidified for me. And they believe within this ideology ultimately posits that if you want to then get out of this state of mind, because it really is in their minds a state of mind, the way you can do that is that you can change how you perform your gender, because at its root, according to this thinking, my queerness was a gender issue, because again, I was, identifying more with women. And so if I were only to change how I presented gender wise, and then would change that, gender presentation to more masculine and to be more masculine, that over time I could habituate a masculine persona, and then not just habituate this persona and it be a persona, but it ultimately, I wouldn't just be acting like a man, I would just become a man. And this is, again, what the delusion that these folks have, that you're able to change. Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly it, actually. So I went into this world, this conversion therapy upside down moral system, for 4 years, and I would meet with my conversion therapist, and we would talk about all these things, and we would, go over how I was doing and how I was changing, and we talked about my quote unquote slip ups and my victories. My victories were moments that I avoided temptation, and then he would also ask me about my slip ups, which were my times that I gave into temptation. And so he used to ask like a lot of really creepy, looking back, detailed questions, and ask for like an inventory of what I had done that week.
I was getting that sense, like just to interject really quick, like the whole time I'm getting the sense, I'm like, it sounds like a kink for these guys. Like they're really just enjoying this conversation. So I think it's interesting that you said that. Continue.
Well, even when we first started, meeting, and we were talking about like my relationship with my mom and my dad, he also asked a lot of detailed questions, like what kind of porn do you like? What do you masturbate to? Like
Oh,
all of
wow.
this kind of stuff. And you're like, I'm 18, and like you're asking questions about when I was like 14. Like this is so bizarre. And
Yeah.
at the time, I chalked it up to him being being a pastor and being someone who's looking out for my best interest. But now looking back, I of course question what he was doing with this information, and afterwards with the box of tissues and Vaseline. Like I don't know.
Right.
It's just incredibly creepy looking back. But this was certainly part of what we talked about, and we also talked about this book that he had given me. My book was like a conversion therapy manual. Mine was Alan Mettinger's Growth into Manhood: Resuming the Journey. We read the Bible together. We prayed together. And there was also like a very physical component to our meetings, where every time I would see him, he would give me this like big bear hug at the beginning and at the end of our meetings. And then on top of that, he would also always lay his hands on me when we prayed, and it was either on my shoulder or my leg. And I talked to a few other folks who met with him as well, and they remembered this leg touching too. And it wasn't enough to be like, "Hey, don't touch me," but it was enough to be like, "You clocked it. You definitely felt his hands."
Off a little.
You know what I mean? Like you're like, something's not right here. And so that for me was again, at the time, it wasn't enough for me not to go, but it was enough for me to say like, that feels a little weird. But again, I always made it up in my mind that he was doing it to sort of like show me like good touch, bad touch, which is of course like a wildly infantilizing gesture. But also now looking back, I can see perhaps the other reasons or motivations for that aspect of our meetings. And so that was really the experience, and that was for 4 years. I went through their group conversion therapy program. I only went once. And really, the reason why I went in the first place was to see if I could find, other gay guys on campus. And so it didn't really work out. I mean, I met one guy who I thought was cute, and that was that. And that's actually the story that I've written about in the book Shame, Sex, Attraction. And I've left the other story, which is the one-on-one meetings. That's going to be the story that I'll include for my next book. I thought I would save that until later. But that was really my experience in conversion therapy. And I think a lot of times when I talk about this, people will oftentimes say, "Oh, that doesn't sound so bad. That doesn't sound terrible. Like you talk about it as if it was this horrible thing." And it's like, in the moment, I would say that it didn't seem like this horrible thing in the moment. In the moment, it always felt like he was helping me. It always felt like he was looking out for my best interest, that he was absolving me in a lot of ways of my guilt, because he would say, "This doesn't define you. This doesn't define you. This doesn't define you. And know that if you just keep working, and you just keep your eyes on the prize, focus on Jesus, things will change." Well, that all sounded great to me at the time. But the problem is once I left conversion therapy, once I left Liberty, I went off into the world by myself, and no change was happening. And I thought to myself, and I would talk to God about this. I was like, "God, how is it that I've done everything I possibly could? I met with Pastor Dane. I read my Bible. I fasted for ultimately, like if we were to add up all the weeks that I fasted, it'd be months in total that I fasted, right? I did all these things and nothing changed. And so in that world, you believe that God's perfect. So if God's perfect and God wants you to change, and you're not changing, who's the problem, God or you? Obviously not God. Again, within this system, the problem is you. And when you start seeing yourself as a problem, when you start seeing yourself as an issue, that is when the damage hits. That's when the guilt, so feeling bad about one specific thing, turns into shame. It's not about one specific thing that I've done anymore. It's now that me as a person, not just that action, but me as a person is dirty. Me as a person is fundamentally damaged, disgusting, gross, and the list goes on with different adjectives. And so that for me is really the enduring fruits of conversion therapy was the damage, not the time in that space that really, messed me up. It was the time after that really compounded all those messages and then amplified them in such a way that it brought me to a place of not just shame, but also self-hatred and self-abnegation, right? It really, really messed me up. And that was, again, for me, the damage. So that's an overview, and that's sort of a window into my conversion experience. Of course, within the collection, Your Shame, Sex, Attraction, the book, there's a multitude of different stories. There are so many different varieties of conversion therapy that are not just within evangelical context, but other contexts. and that happen not just in the US South or in a pastor's basement, but they happen in different organizations across the country, across the world. And conversion practices are unfortunately not a thing of the past. They're still very much happening, which is why we put the collection together in the first place, to bear witness to this and to hope that, again, it's perhaps a pipe dream, but in hopes of ultimately seeing an end to these practices. Will that happen? Probably not, but I do hope so.
Yeah, at least make a difference in it. Well, first of all, I want to say I'm very sorry that you went through that. I can imagine that was pretty traumatic to experience, and like such a denial and hatred of self it's just the worst. Like, I know in my own journey of finding my way back to myself, it's been the most beautiful and gratifying work of my life. So on the other end of that spectrum, it's just like, I can't even put it into words, like the antithesis of what we're here for on this earth, in these lives. But I'm very sorry you had to experience that.
Thank you.
I also, and I have wondered this, and I can't help but it just kind of sounds like, from what you're describing and from what I've, especially with the camps and, children being taken away from their families to go through this, it just feels like a hotbed of predators and like an ideal scenario, because when you have that much shame and then you have the person blaming themselves and like, I'm the problem here, and this is the person who's connected to God who is not the problem. Even if that person becomes the abuser, there's still going to be this internalization of I'm the problem, and so much that's not being said because of the amount of shame. And I can only imagine how much sexual abuse is happening in these environments, just like within the Catholic Church. It's like an environment that breeds that, and it's really unfortunate. And I hope that it does eventually come to an end, hopefully sooner rather than later. I do hold a vision for a new kind of earth and a new level of expression in humanity. And I do believe that there will be a day when that doesn't exist. I don't know, again, if it'll be in our lifetimes, but I hold out hope for that for everybody. Yeah, definitely.
Going back to the collection, Shame, Sex, Attraction, it does offer this wide variety, right? And it offers, stories from Orthodox Jewish context. It offers a story from a secular familial context where one's conversion therapist was one's mother. It offers a story from what the author describes as a Chinese cult, and how his mother, who was a part of this cult, was his conversion therapist and arguably even his dad. And so, again, I think a lot of times we think that conversion practices are happening only within, Christian context. And the research does back up that the vast majority of conversion practices happen in these contexts. Like, that is without doubt. However, there are a number of conversion practices that happen, again, even in medical context today, specifically with, trans folks. That, what doctors claim to be, care is really just conversion practices wrapped up in medical rhetoric. And so I think that we have to be cognizant of the fact that it's not only within these religious spaces, that it does exceed these religious spaces. Granted, again, it really is happening mostly in these religious spaces, but, a number of other contexts certainly breed the conditions for conversion practices to thrive.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I remember what we were going to circle back to was talking about like coercive control. And you were saying that you made this choice, but then really within a cult-like setting, how much of a choice was it? Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, so I think back and, for the longest time, I was always saying that, at the end of the day, it was me who decided to do this. At the end of the day, it was me who decided to do this. I made this choice to go into conversion therapy. But one time I was talking with someone, and it was actually quite recently, that person said, no person who, was in like a marriage that turned out to be abusive would say, well, at the end of the day, I decided to marry that person. Like, for that person, they didn't know going into that marriage that it was going to be abusive. They didn't know that they were going to be physically or emotionally or sexually or whatever, way that they were abused. They didn't know that was what was coming. And so for me, when I was 18 and I decided that I was going to go through conversion therapy, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what pastoral counseling with Pastor Dane Emmerich was going to be like. And so the person who I was speaking with said, so you can't really say that you made that choice because it wasn't an informed choice. It wasn't, you didn't consent to abuse, and no one ever can or should consent to abuse, right? Which is always, the way I always address when people say nowadays, well, shouldn't people be able to choose conversion therapy if they want it? It's like, no, you should never be able to consent to abuse. And so for me at the time, when I say that I made that choice or I had that agency, in a sense, right? Yes, I, at the end of the day, was the one who signed the dotted line. I mean, I didn't really sign anything, but, metaphorically. But at the same time, I also was, freshly an adult, like I just turned 18, and I didn't know any better. And so my choice, quote unquote, to go into this really was forced upon me, in the sense that I was told I could not be queer and become and stay a Christian. Right? Like I had to choose one or the others, if you could even choose, right? You can choose to be a Christian. You can't choose to be queer, which is sort of the irony now, but, or was then. It's just, I've realized the irony today. But I think that, that's why I think it is complicated. And that's why I think it is more sort of, it's grayer than it is black and white, that I chose this, but also the choice was made for me. I didn't really have a say, because I was told it's one or the other. And if you don't choose God, then get the hell out. And I chose to stay the hell in. And it really was, in a lot of ways, a living hell.
Yeah. Well, and that's like in the cult environment, there is a lot that's technically considered choice, but when there's brainwashing and coercion involved, like, it's not exactly consensual. Like the authentic you with agency wouldn't make that choice. You, under those influences, yes, sure, technically you made the choice, so I could see a lot of that within the church systems. I know when I was, I don't know, probably in my early teens or puberty or what age. And to be honest, I don't even remember what brought up the conversation. But my mom actually said to me, like, oh, I'll love you no matter what, as long as you don't become a lesbian or marry a black man. And so looking into my, I'm like, oh, well, I'm not gay. I've never been gay or whatever. And I still, do prefer men, but I have, like, in my adulthood, the more free I become, realize that it is a spectrum, and that I'm attracted to a variety of people that, had that conversation not happen, how would I have formed differently? Like, what would have happened differently in my own sexuality and experience and, like, of identity? So yeah, it's easy to say it's a choice, but then when you have your caregiver giving you this choice of, I won't love you, like, literally, I'll disown you. I remember her saying that I would disown you. How much choice is there in that when you're depending on that person for survival, and you need their love? Like, it's a human need to be loved and accepted in community, and at an age where you really don't understand those kinds of things. So it's important to, and I can imagine, my mom is, I don't consider her a bad person. Like, she's, we are all troubled and have our own, she has also been indoctrinated under this religion and has her own, beliefs. And I still love my mother and am in relationship with her. But, how many people that, just like all of these men in the church who are so dogmatic about the queer community, that are having their own shame experience within their own self-denial, like, how many situations like mine have happened that have led to this, where we're at now. It's easy to say it's a choice, but when you go deep, I can imagine the homes that were worse than mine. Like, what would that have been like for those people to grow up in that understanding, and I had forgotten about that completely. And then as an adult, I'm remembering this, and I'm like, oh, like, I can imagine that influenced some of my choices and my attraction and otherwise. And I also remember growing up in the church, like, we were taught that it was a demon possession, that homosexuality was a demon, and that, that had taken over the person. And that you just had to, like, cast out those devils and then you would be straight or whatever. So yeah, I just think there's so many levels, so much depth to the conversation to be had for people. And the more love and acceptance we can have for ourselves, then we'll find that for each other and find a place for everyone and everyone's expression. But yeah, looking throughout human history, I think that pansexuality or bisexuality is really just part of our nature, and that we're all on some sort of a spectrum to some degree, whether we realize it or not. And I think,
I mean, that's even like Freud thought that everyone was bisexual. There's a number of sexologists who since have argued similar, ideas that it's a lot less stable, our sexuality than we'd like to or that a lot of people would like to think, right? And I think that's just more accurate. I think it's just that a lot of people have anxiety or fear of that reality, which is again why we see so much anti-queer rhetoric and action, really because it's based out of the anxiety or the fear that they see themselves in us, and are scared of it.
Yeah.
And so often, so many of us really, we live in a chaotic universe. There's a lot of, craziness going on around us, whether it be here on Earth or I suppose in outer space, though I've never been, but I'm only assuming. All this to say that there's, a lot, the world around us oftentimes seems unsure. It seems scary. It seems chaotic. And so often we latch on to things that offer us, whether it's, a false sense or a sense that is actually sort of like true to reality. We look for stability, right? We look for, and oftentimes narratives, stories offer us stability. It's a way to make sense of the chaos around us. We're able to organize and order the world around us by way of stories. We're able to, through the way we identify, offer our sense, ourselves a sense of stability. And I think that for those of us who are queer, for those who are trans, for those who are not within that really rigid, defined, understood, and up until this point, mutually agreed upon sort of like place of identity. For those of us who are outside of that or transgress those boundaries, that offers, a lot of people, that really makes them scared, right? It makes people nervous that we don't align with, again, like that sort of established, capital T truth. That we're either men or we're either women or either straight or that we're just straight.
Mm-hmm.
When those of us who are different really throw that into question or into chaos, that for a lot of people troubles a lot of the foundational beliefs they have about the world, and ultimately then therefore their sense of security and their sense of safety. I think as we're a threat to people because we are not aligning with how they understand reality. And so I think that a lot of people try their best to position themselves within these like fixed understandings of identity, because to do otherwise is to call into question a lot of foundational beliefs. And so I think that people have a sense of security, they have a sense of safety and comfortability with these identity markers of straight, of, man, of woman, whatever. And for those of us who transgress those boundaries, again, we stir up some trouble for them in a really deep-seated way. Even if, it shouldn't, it does. I think that it scares people.
Yeah. And I think, that's one thing I've learned through doing therapy myself is that, as rigid and traumatic as being in the evangelical church was, there was also very much a security in that of knowing if I follow these rules, I'm good. I'm a good person. I'm going to heaven. I'm safe. If I don't follow these rules, then I'm not. So it just gave me a very it's even now, and I'm getting there, but especially in the past year or two, there are things I'm like, I don't know what's the right answer. And my therapist would be like, you get to decide that. And I'm like, but no, I just need you to tell me what's the right answer. How am I supposed to feel about this? And because it is so much easier, to default to what you've been told, because then you don't have to take accountability for getting it wrong or for what happens as a result of the choices that you make. If you have this binary, this very black and white, follow these rules, you're good. Break these rules, you're bad. Yeah. There is a laziness in that, a lack of accountability and a just turning over your personal accountability to something outside of yourself. And that's something, because I always felt like it was such hard work to be a good Christian. It takes so much denial of self, so much, pushing aside temptation and rising above it and willpower. But really, when I get down to the nitty gritty, the hard part is being authentic, is saying no to all of those things and deciding for oneself what you believe in, allowing that to change when it needs to change, and standing by it for better or for worse. This is what I've chosen, not because somebody made me, not because somebody taught me into it, because this is what came from the inside and I'm putting it on the outside and taking responsibility for it. you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember being within the evangelical world, and yeah, you're right. Like having that sort of assuredness that you knew the answers to everything. Everything is right, wrong, good, evil, of God, of the enemy, whatever. Having such a defined order was so comforting, was so nice. But like you said, it's this lazy way of being, and it's also an intellectually dishonest way of being, right? Like, and I think that's also like a defining feature of evangelicalism is anti-intellectualism. But it's very much just saying, okay, I know the right answer here and over here. And, again, going back to responsibility and abdicating responsibility, saying, well, that's what God says. That's just what God says. Oh, well, I think it's wrong to be gay. Why? Well, that's just what God says. And that absolves them in their estimation of any, ill, intent or ill will or, acting poorly. They think that they're fine because, well, at the end of the day, that's just what God says. Therefore, and it's this sort of ridiculous understanding of the world. But again, it allows people that, to abdicate responsibility and just say, well, that's what God wants. But it's also very comforting and safe. And I missed that once I gave up my faith. I missed having an answer to everything. Granted, now would I go back to that? Hell no. Like there's no desire. That again, it's intellectually dishonest. It doesn't map onto reality. There is also a lot, I think, for those of us with a conscience, we didn't feel good about a lot of those beliefs that we had. We would say like, oh, I just don't understand why God thinks this or says this. And for those of us who said that, we were like, well, yeah, it's not good because God says it is. And that maybe was a crack in the system that allowed us exit from it, or at least, pushed us out of out of the system a little bit. And I think that once we sort of kept pulling on that thread, the whole thing unraveled. Again, for those of us who are thinking, for those of us who are feeling, and again, empathetic individuals. And so it's both comforting and you have a sense of security, but it's also a site of anxiety when you don't fit that system, when you're like, no, actually, I don't agree with this. And actually, I don't think this is okay. It's a wedge in the theology. It's a wedge in that binary system that pushes us ultimately out. And thank God it did.
Yeah. Yeah. So Wendy and I could have this conversation all day. I want to honor your time, but winding down, like, at what point did you finally just like say no more of this? I'm not going to try to live this way. I'm not going to subscribe to this life. And what did that look like? Like literally leaving the church. What did that look like for you?
Yeah. So I had already left the church. Like I wasn't going to church for a few years, but it was really, I still remember I was on my couch. I was in Florida. I was living there doing my PhD. And when I was reading Elie Wiesel, I was actually like, sitting there studying, and all of a sudden I saw something on like Instagram. I was probably like on a study break, just looking on my phone. And so I'm there and someone had said something along the lines of like too blessed to be stressed. Like God gave me a free Starbucks coffee or something like this. And I remember sitting there going, wait a second. You think that God gave you a free Starbucks coffee? Like God took time out of God's day to give you a free Starbucks coffee when I don't know, outside of the Starbucks, there's someone sitting there begging for, change and so they can have even just a cup of coffee. You think that God did that for you, but didn't do that for them. And that was the moment where I was like, okay, I can't believe in a good God. I can't believe that, it was possible, or that I can't believe that God would make that possible for that person, but not make that possible for other people. And so that made me think, okay, ultimately then, God is doing some good things for some people and not doing good things for others. And of course, a gift is an active decision on God's part. So if God's actively giving someone a gift, that means God's actively not giving a gift over here. And that for me was just, again, maybe I should have thought of this like years before. Maybe this should have been a thought in my mind, but it simply wasn't. And so by the time I was sitting there and reading about the Holocaust, reading about protesting God, reading about, God's goodness, and in this case, God's, sort of like how evil God was in allowing specifically the Holocaust, but again, extrapolating beyond that for me was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I was just like, I can't subscribe to this anymore. And again, it was a lot of growing pains. Like for me, it was a lot of like leaving, that faith system behind and missing God in some cases, missing that sense of security and assuredness. But ultimately, it was so much better to live authentically and honestly than to uphold a fiction that I knew was a fiction and knew was ridiculous, because how in the world could God ever defend God's self? If God was on trial, God would go to jail, Yeah. And that for me was enough to get me the hell out. And again, I'm so thankful I'm no longer there. And I think life is just so much better. I recently had someone reach out to me and say like, oh, I didn't realize you're not a Christian anymore. I feel so bad. And I said, please don't feel bad. I said, life is significantly better these days. And they just didn't respond to the message because I could tell that they were pissed. But it is like, life is so much better. Despite the fact that I don't know what's going to happen in eternity. If there even is eternity, we'll find out. But I just know that living authentically and living truly and honestly is much more important than holding fast to a lie, a fiction.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. So if you could leave our guests with any piece of advice, someone who is questioning maybe their sexuality or their faith or any part of this life, what would you leave them with?
Oh, goodness. I think information is so cool. And what I mean by that is, go and talk to someone. They're a source of information. And again, not that they're, infallible or that they are necessarily even an authority on a topic, but to have a good conversation partner. And that conversation partner can be, again, a person. It can be a book. It can be an article online. It can be anything. But explore. Knowledge should never be dangerous. Knowledge should never be something that you're scared of. If you don't agree with it, then you don't agree with it. Cool. Then move on. But if you do agree with it, oh, cool. You've just discovered something new, something that could ultimately open your world up. Right. So I always say, talk to people who disagree with you, have conversations with people who, have very different lives than you. Because ultimately that's going to open you up in such a way that, again, you might be able to confirm that you believe what you believe. Cool. If that's the case, amazing. Now you have an even more justified reason for why you believe what you believe or you do what you do. But it also might be something that's going to be an entrance into a new world and maybe even an exit from the world you're in now. And if that world that you're in now is so fragile that, accessing information that differs from your opinion is scary, then maybe you should question the very foundation of your epistemology of how you know things and why you believe things, right? And so I always think that again, reading is so cool. And if you like to read my new book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, shameless plug. And if talking to people is more your jam, which for me historically that's always been what I've done more so than reading, which is sort of ironic as as an academic, but for me, I prefer having conversations and talking to people and hearing their thoughts. And so go out, read, explore ideas with people in community. It's always better in community, and think for yourself. Yeah,
that's beautiful advice. How can people find you? Of course,
so
I'll link your books in the description for all who are listening. But
phenomenal. So social media, I'm Luke Slam Dunk Wilson on Instagram. I'm Luke Slam Dunk Wilson on Threads. I'm Luke Slam Dunk Wilson on Blue Sky. And I tried to stay consistent, so I made my name on Twitter, Wilson_FW. But otherwise, I'm on LinkedIn, I think, as Lucas Wilson, or Facebook as Luke Wilson. You can find me on pretty much any social media platform. I'm even on what's that one? TikTok. But I haven't posted a video yet, so probably not worth following. Everything else I'm pretty active on, particularly Instagram. So Instagram is maybe the go-to. Luke Slam Dunk Wilson.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate the work you're doing in the world and who you are. And thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. This has been super fun.
Awesome. All right. Have a wonderful day. Aloha.
Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this episode, the best way to show your support is to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, share your thoughts by leaving a 5-star review. It really helps more people to find this space. Want to go deeper? Head over to my website at leavingthechurchtofindgod.com. There, you can make a donation and make sure that we continue to have these conversations. No matter where you are on your spiritual journey, if you or someone you know would like to join the podcast and tell your story, please reach out to me on Instagram at authenticallymelly. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep finding your own unique connection to something greater. Until next time, stay authentic, stay open, and aloha.